reproduction of animals. So we're on page 111 in your notes, and we're talking about reproduction and growth and development because they're pretty closely tied when you're studying a multicellular organism like an animal. All animals are multicellular.
So all animals reproduce sexually during their lives. They use meiosis to make sperm and egg, which then combine during fertilization. Some organisms, like your earthworms, are actually hermaphrodites, which means they make sperm and egg on the same body, but they're still going to exchange gametes with another organism.
So anytime you hear sperm and egg, you need to think haploid and you need to think gamete. So gametes are sex cells, sperm and egg. So anytime you see sperm and egg or gamete or haploid or meiosis, all of those are words that go together with sexual reproduction. Keep in mind, making a sperm and egg isn't sexual reproduction. That's just making a haploid cell. You still have to exchange gametes, and the exchange of gametes is really called fertilization.
So then our aquatic organisms are a little different. They're going to use external fertilization. This allows them to release the gametes even without finding a particular partner or mate.
And so this is going to be an adaptation, and they're actually going to have to release a lot of sperm and a lot of egg and then just abandon them.
Land organisms are going to use internal fertilization, and this requires finding a mate, but then the fertilized egg is more protected.
So when we talk about land organisms, we're talking about mammals, we're talking about insects, we're talking about reptiles, we're talking about birds. So all of the land organisms use internal fertilization. And this is why later we're actually going to see that finding a mate is one of the hardest parts. This is why we see all these courtship behaviors. So keep in mind, this part has to do with sexual reproduction, but when you get fertilization, you just get a single diploid cell. So exchanging the gametes only gives you one cell, and that's not a new animal.
So some organisms, the embryo, after we fertilize our sperm has fertilized our eggs, we have our embryo, and that's going to change into an organism during the growth and development process. Some organisms, like fish and insects, are going to produce many offspring in hopes that some of them will survive to maturity, whereas your many land animals are going to provide protection for the embryo, like some reptiles and birds will lay their eggs, while others will protect the embryo internally in the placenta like mammals do. As the organisms grow, their bodies are going to experience changes.
So we want to pause there and make sure we remember what it means to grow. So the embryo was the zygote, is another word for it, and that is going to be a diploid organism. So sperm plus egg equals embryo. So now we have this little baby embryo. What happens to it? Some organisms have to abandon them. Some will provide protection like an egg. Some provide internal protection. But that protection is there for as the new baby is growing. And so by grow, we're actually going to be seeing asexual reproduction through mitosis. So mitosis is where we're going to make identical cells. So you can see here in this diagram, you've got your egg, and then the egg and sperm come together to be a new embryo. And that organism has to grow. And growth is when you add cells. Your cells don't get bigger, you get more cells.
So organisms like insects and amphibians go through a whole body change, and that's called a metamorphosis, which is an adaptation that allows them to live in different habitats. Other organisms that develop internally and only develop to prepare for sexual reproduction.
So when we talk about growth and development, so reproduction is making a new organism, but growth is adding more cells, getting bigger, but development is changing. So So if you look at the caterpillar to the butterfly, that's actually a very different organism. It's using its DNA very differently. And the advantage of a metamorphosis, whether it's a caterpillar to butterfly, whether it's a tadpole to a frog, whether it's a maggot to a fly, this idea of a metamorphosis helps them live in different habitats. But it does require a big investment because they're going to use their genes really differently. So insects and amphibians develop during a whole body change. Other organisms, like mammals, will only develop when they're ready to prepare for sexual reproduction. So when we talk about like going through puberty, that's when humans really do their developing.
So next we have regulation. Regulation of mature body is achieved through the synthesis and use of hormones to send signals to other cells in order to maintain homeostasis. Animals are going to use protein synthesis to make specifically shaped hormones to respond to changes in their environment and the internal body.
And that's somewhere that we want to stop for a second as well, because animals need to be able to respond to things in their environment and their body, and these changes are sometimes called stimuli. And so when there's a really loud noise, you know that you turn your head and you look to hear what that loud noise was. But there are other changes in the environment that cause your body to have to regulate. So what about when it's really cold or really hot? What if you're really hungry? What if you're really full? And so the animal's body is going to respond to that. And regulation, we know, means to control. So how do we control the body? One of the big ways is through using hormones to maintain, remember, homeostasis means balanced internal conditions. So when we look at maintaining homeostasis, we're saying how can we balance our conditions based on what's going outside the body and what's going on inside the body.
So many animals are going to be able to use sensory organs to perceive changes in their environment. The senses then use the nerve cells to send chemical or electrical signals to their brain, which is the regulatory center of the animal.
So just a reminder, sensory organs are things like eyes and ears and taste and touch. And so the nerve, your nerves actually go all the way to your skin, to your eye, to your ear, to your mouth, to your nose. All of your senses are really just your nerves being able to tell that something has changed. And the sense, the nerve, will then send a signal mostly to the brain. Now you do have quick reflexes, so this picture is an example of a reflex. But you're really using signaling pathways to communicate.
The brain can then control movement patterns, moving away from a bad smell, or controlling internal responses like raising your blood sugar for the fight or flight response.
So in the next unit, we're going to be talking about animal behavior. And that's going to be things like movement, like courtship behavior, like migration, but also like the ability to fight or flight if there's some sort of danger. And all of this comes back to being able to regulate the body, and the main way the body does that is through hormones. And so we have to be able to identify that hormones are really proteins. So when we talked about plants, we said plants perform photosynthesis to make their own food. The main thing the animal makes are proteins that are going to act as hormones. So when we talk about controlling the blood sugar, what we're actually talking about is the hormone insulin and the opposite hormone, glucagon, which if you know anyone who's diabetic, they actually have to carry glucagon shots as well. And so this is kind of where we stop. We've been all the way through animals, but we need to really make sure that we understand how the animal body works